The nickname for this time period is Bleeding Kansas, and it's when the Kansas and Nebraska territories get settled and an attempt is made to form new states through the use of the popular sovereignty approach, and it doesn't go very well. We'll start our story here with Stephen A. Douglas. He's the senator from Illinois. He is a Democrat. He is known as the Little Giant. He's the one who put the Compromise of 1850 through the Senate by breaking it up into 5 different bills, which ends up working after the Senate has rejected it as a total package. So he becomes the chairman of the Senate Committee on Territories, and he wants his home city of Chicago to become the railroad hub for all traffic going into pretty much what used to be the Louisiana Purchase. So that means that all of these lands now have to become territories. Now, the Missouri Compromise says that all those territories are supposed to be free, but this is a problem because there are a lot more territories above the compromise line than below the compromise line, and that's going to mess up the balance in the Senate if they get to be states. But Douglas introduces a bill to create territories, and then he omits the provision against slavery that has been in place for 35 years. He just leaves it out. Douglas's bill creates 2 territories, the Kansas Territory and the Nebraska Territory. And Douglas repeals the Missouri Compromise from the language of the bill and inserts popular sovereignty as the way the territories will decide if they are slave or free. No one really knows how the people in the territories are going to vote on this issue. So Northern Democrats, Free Soilers, and Whigs are all outraged, but the Senate passed the bill pretty easily. In the House, the fight got nasty. Ultimately, President Franklin Pierce, who's Democrat and a Northerner, pressures the Northern Democrats to go along and support the bill, and eventually they do. But this pressure really pulls apart the parties. The Whigs alienate their supporters by courting Catholics and recent immigrants. Democrats get torn over slavery between North and South. Free Soilers just have one issue and really don't have a broad appeal. So we see slavery pull together a lot of people on both sides of the issue. Abolitionists from the Free Soil and the Liberty parties unite with anti-slavery Whigs and Northern Democrats and anti-know-nothing Democrats, and they form a new party, the Republican Party. In 1854, this party forms. They're called the American Party, and they come together out of a secret society. The members, if they're asked about it, have to respond, "I know nothing." So they become known as the Know Nothing Party. They are anti-immigration, America Firsters, anti-drinkers, anti-Catholics. They advocate for a longer period for naturalization. They try to get any politician out of office who works on behalf of immigrants. They're basically haters. They fall apart before the 1856 election. Douglas's act touches off a race between anti- and pro-slavery people to get to Kansas first and settle it first. Missouri, being a slave state, has plenty of pro-slavery and anti-slavery people, so Missouri residents pour across the border and begin settling. Towns in Kansas become free or they become slave. So, for instance, the town of Lawrence here is a free town, while the town of Lecompton here is a slave town. So the first elections get held in 1855, and Missouri residents pour across the border pretending to live in Kansas, and they stuff the ballot boxes. There's huge voter fraud. Popular sovereignty is clearly not working. A pro-slavery legislature forms in Lecompton and immediately begins passing laws preventing anti-slavery settlers from settling anywhere, owning any property, and voting. They curtail freedom of speech and freedom of press, and they claim to represent the whole state. Free staters hold a convention, draft a constitution prohibiting slavery, and ask Congress to be admitted to the Union as now a free state. And this causes violence to break out on both sides. As you can see by these maps, there are major violent outbreaks, and they're attacks by abolitionists and by pro-slavery forces. In May of 1856, the raid on Lawrence happens. The U.S. District Court issues arrest warrants for leaders in Lawrence, and U.S. Marshals with a posse made up of pro-slavery drunks from Missouri storm the town, wreck the newspaper, burn the hotel, and then leave. That causes this man, John Brown, and his sons and a few followers to decide to go get revenge. So John Brown is a Calvinist. He's a very severe abolitionist. He says, quote, "God has raised me up on purpose to break the jaws of the wicked," unquote. So he, his sons, and the followers head to Pottawatomie Creek. They burst into the house of James Doyle, who's a pro-slavery man from Tennessee. They take him and his sons outside, and they chop them up with machetes and cutlasses. They do this at 2 more houses. Not one of the men Brown and his followers killed had anything to do with Lawrence, nor did they even own slaves. But his actions are popularized, he becomes infamous, and it triggers even more fighting. The events in Kansas also have repercussions in the House and the Senate. This man, Charles Sumner, who is a senator from the state of, you guessed it, Massachusetts, gives a speech entitled, quote, "The Crime Against Kansas," in which he mocks the state of South Carolina and one of its senators, and he makes several sexually suggestive references to that senator's wife. That causes this guy, Preston Brooks, who is a member of the House of Representatives from South Carolina, to become incensed by the speech. He is angry beyond all reason. And so several days later, he comes into the Senate and proceeds to attack Senator Sumner with his cane, beating him over the head with it. Cane breaks into 3 pieces, and Brooks continues. Sumner is left bloody and unconscious. He suffers post-traumatic stress disorder, and he really doesn't return to the Senate again. This is a good example of some of the propaganda that begins to fly around about this issue based on the caning of Charles Sumner. You'll recognize that name because when you drive to Logan Airport through Boston, you go through the Sumner Tunnel. So in the face of all this, the Democratic Party nominates this guy, James Buchanan, to be their candidate for president. The Republicans, a new party, choose John C. Fremont and try to hammer away at Bleeding Kansas and Bleeding Sumner as their major issues. They argue that slavery is going to undermine free labor, and they push the immorality of slavery. Fremont also almost wins, but his coalition is too weak and he ends up losing by 1 state. So Buchanan becomes the president. He is a pro-slavery Democrat from the state of Pennsylvania, which makes him a kind of an oddity in the party and in the country. He attempts to make Kansas a pro-slave state and force the pro-slavery constitution from Lecompton, Kansas through the Senate after promising that it's going to be a fair vote. Douglas just denounces this move publicly as unfair, and that drives many conservatives to the Republican Party. Douglas ends up losing support from Southern money and Southern Democrats, and he finds himself in a tight battle for re-election against a new Illinois congressman by the name of Abraham Lincoln. So we'll come back to Abraham Lincoln, and we'll also come back to John Brown, and we'll come back to Buchanan and this whole issue again. Stay tuned.